Well, everybody, welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and I'm a pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless Chaplaincy and my good friends at Care Portal. Care Portal is a technology platform that exists to help families that are at risk of going into the foster care system stay out of the foster care system by connecting them with agencies and groups like local churches and resources that can help them navigate that. And we're so thankful for their partnership in the podcast. And I'm really excited for the time that we have today. Joining me on the podcast is Lisa Cuss. I had the opportunity to talk with Lisa and get to know her a little bit at a conference that her and her husband put on called the Unlocking Faith Conference. It was in Colorado. And her husband, they spend a lot of time in the world of helping people navigate chronic anxiety and work through things that block their ability to connect with God and to grow in their life. And so, Lisa, just super excited to have you on and tell us a little bit about why this work and what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I love to join on any podcasts that are like-minded in this work. And so I started this work. I used to be a school teacher, actually. And then through several events of loss in my life and weariness, I think, just in expectations that I had of myself, being a pastor's wife and even just a child of God, decided, man, I was able to take some classes and do some combination of spirituality, faith, and psychology in the intersection. And it helped me so much that I decided to go back and get my master's in it. And so now I've been in this world for 7 years and have my own private practice and am just amazed at the healing that could come in the world of trauma in people's lives. And so I love what I do and just find it an honor to be able to sit alongside others in the journey.
So with coming out of education, and I resonate with this, listeners know my wife's a first grade teacher. In Michigan, at least, we're just seeing a huge change in trauma coming into the classroom. Children who have been through highly traumatic events, a lot of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that they're seeing. But I'm also seeing a lot of teachers coming out of COVID who are still processing through the trauma of what really the last few years and the political upheaval did to them. And it's so interesting when you talk about trauma, what that actually does to a person when you're in these sustained periods of toxic stress. And so it maybe for those listening, how would you define trauma in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So we define trauma as just any experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. So whether you're experiencing it secondhand, whether you're right in the middle of it, whether it's a series of just events and triggers that have created a deep meaning within you. But it just means that you are overwhelmed in your ability to cope with it and to move through. And, it gets kind of nuanced because it's like, well, what does that mean, really overwhelmed with your ability to cope? When we can think our way through things, when things kind of make us pause or step back, but then we can think and get through it, we're probably not overwhelmed. When we're overwhelmed is when we cannot think our way through things and something in our body just stops us and we find ourselves, going into the fight, the freeze, the flee, or the fawn response more often than we wish.
Yeah. And that can come in any situation. And you can be okay. You can be okay for a long time. And then all of a sudden something hits you. My wife and I were invited into a space over the weekend where a young family, they lost a newborn child. And we were there with them. I was there in the room when they had to make the decision to take their 4-month-old off of life support. And as I processed through that, I mean, this happened on Friday. As I processed through that, and I had some time to give some space to it, there was a moment where I didn't have a context for that kind of grief. I didn't have a context for that kind of loss, and that was a trauma. That was a trauma for me. And I have to dignify that and realize that that happened because there's nothing I could do to solve that. And that was secondhand for me. And it was brief and it was short, but it was still a trauma that I need to recognize. And I think that's part of it too, is like, you can have moments like that. And then you can go on the next day and basically be okay because you're past it, but it still happened. And that's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And I love that you bring up, trauma can be stored in our body for quite a while and we may not know. And then all of a sudden it can be triggered in a way that we can become flooded and stuck.
Yeah.
And I love that you recognized that it was a trauma moment for a moment.
Yes.
And even being able then to become aware of that and to name it and then to move on the next day is super helpful because you're realizing it was, as you look back, it was a part of you. Yes. It wasn't your whole experience. Yes. And so even that is just powerful for the next time, that it may not surprise you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a great book, Widen the Window. I don't know if you've read that or not. It's written by a woman who grew up in the military, essentially. And the military has a motto that is basically suck it up and drive on. And that's, I think, a way a lot of us that we will handle trauma is like, okay, that happened, and now suck it up and drive on. And then all of a sudden you get 10 miles down the road and you don't realize that you've been carrying on to this while you've been driving on. And now you are unable to drive on and you're unable to do anything else because it's been so profound and so hard. And I think when you talk about the parts of us that are impacted, one of the things that resonated with me is you were talking through this reality of trauma. What happens in our anxiety was this concept of like parts, that there are parts of us that work in some ways to protect us. And then you started going into internal family systems or IFS. And so you have a lot of experience with IFS. And one of the reasons why bringing you on the podcast was for you to maybe explain a little bit, how does that work? What is that kind of work like? And then how does that help us give context to some of the trauma that we go through? And how have you seen people work through it in that way?
Yeah. Well, let me start with just a current trauma experience that I've had that I know I need work on. And I'm trying to do my own work, but I think I probably need professional help as well. And that would be driving in heavy traffic for me. So there's so many parallels with driving and driver's seat, and you just referred to one as well. But for me, it really is driving in heavy traffic. And so when I was a teenager, I was in a pretty big accident. Luckily walked out, wasn't hurt badly, but the sounds, the fear, I've been in multiple accidents turning left, that has impacted me. So there's a high caution for me when I turn left. And I've also lost some dear friends to car accidents.
Wow.
So whenever you layer things on like that, it's really not just one event, but it's several layers. I have something that I have this sense that sits in my body. Is it always in traffic? No. But when I'm in heavy traffic or turning left, or and we can get to this, if my window of tolerance, my ability to connect with myself, and connect with God or be able to see the wider view of the world and be okay, if that is narrow and low, then I can go right back into that sense that I need to flee, get out of all traffic, or even shut down, at the wheel if it all feels like it's too much.
Wow.
So I remember even 2 years ago, driving in Denver traffic. And I missed a turn, and there was all these people coming, and I was waiting for my maps to tell me what to do next. And it was all the right things, right, to make me just feel like, I mean, honestly, I felt overwhelmed to cope with what was coming at me. And so I just had to like breathe through it, get to a place where I could pull over. I had to take a couple of deep breaths, and then I had to realize this is a part of me that wants to shut down. It's a part of me that feels like I have no hope, or I can't do this. It's a part of me that's getting really anxious, even though things are okay. It is not all of me. And as soon as I can remember that it's just a part of me and not all of me, then there's a window for me to be curious, and to reflect, and to look at it, whether that's with somebody else or not.
Wow.
And so when we look at internal family systems, it was developed by Dr. Dick Schwartz. And the whole idea is that oftentimes we wrestle inside of us. Like, one part of us wants to do one thing, one part of us wants to do something else. I mean, as simple as, what do I want to eat for dinner? Well, one part of me really wants to reach for the fries that are in the fridge and I just have to throw in the air fryer. One part of me really wants to do the salad because I want to feel better for tomorrow. One part of me wants another drink of wine. One part of me wants the water because I know that's going to be best. One part of me really is, I know I'm tired, but I really want to do everything I can to connect with my teenage kid. Another part of me just wants to scroll and shut down and let them do their scrolling. And so you have these parts that just wrestle inside of us. And it's actually the war that we feel inside that can make us feel anxious and stuck, and at times not know what to do. So IFS is developed with the idea that we have a core self, and that is not a part. It is who we are. And as followers of Christ, from a faith perspective, we look at that our self it's a spirit-led self, or it's the image of God in us. Even if we haven't chosen, I believe, to follow Christ, the fact that we are created with a longing for something bigger than us and outside of us is an opening to a God who holds all. And so when I often represent that with a candle, that spirit-led, that God image in us. But when we are in tune with our core self and we are connected to God or to somebody else around us who represents truth and safety, then we can make decisions. We can pull over to take a hot minute. We can realize in that hospital room that was a moment that I felt out of control.
Yeah.
And then we can be able to look at the other parts of us inside of us that are bringing so much anxiety or shutdown or war within us. So you have the self. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No, I'm thinking about the words that Paul says when he says, part of me knows the right thing to do and I don't do it. And part of me does the thing that I don't want to do. And I keep on, and there's this language of that war that you're describing that I think that the Bible supports on and on and on and on, that there are multiple elements of something going on in our souls and we're fractured. I think a little bit of Chuck DeGroat's, book, Wholeheartedness, and the reality, like there are fractured pieces of us. And he talks about IFS in there as well. And that we're kind of at war with ourselves. And sometimes it feels there are parts that feel overwhelming, just completely overwhelming.
Yeah, you're talking about that which I want to do, I don't do. That which I don't want to do, I do. And I feel like if we read that through a human lens, at the end of that, we would just hear Paul going, because it's so frustrating at the end of it. And when we look at, I think the human nature is to try to ignore the war within us
Mm.
or to just diminish it or stuff it or to tell ourselves it's really not that big of a deal. And so we don't tend to move toward what is going on inside of us. And when we look at Jesus' example, his whole example in his 3 years of ministry was to turn toward pain. I mean, even beyond the rules, even beyond the shoulds and oughts, he turned toward with phrases like, what do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
What do you really want?
Yeah.
And when we can take that same compassion and hope, example of hope, and with that turn toward those soldiered up parts of ourselves or those, as we talk about in IFS, exiled experiences of pain, then we're going to get a whole lot further than we are ignoring or pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps or pretending it just doesn't exist in the first place.
Totally. That's the interesting, the phrase "pull yourself up by your bootstraps." That actually came as kind of a joke because it's impossible to pull yourself up.
Have you tried it?
I have tried. I've actually tried it on stage and preaching to make the point because I have bootstraps on them, and I just look really silly because you actually can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that's the whole point of that statement, is that it's impossible to navigate life on your own. And it's an interesting thing when you start thinking through all the dynamics of the human soul. I'm interested. You mentioned this exile. You mentioned, some of these different parts. Can you just briefly explain what are the categories of the parts and really, because I think in IFS language, there's no bad parts, but sometimes they get out of control. And so what is that? Help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah. So all of this is the whole idea that we are born kind of multifaceted. And even in simple terms, if you just take a type A personality versus a type B personality, that you have, some of us are more wired to get going and keep working and figure it out. And some of us are more wired to take a step back and be more present. And that is a matter of how we've been wired, designed, and it's a part of our context. So that we live in and grow up in. And so if we look at the fact that we're multifaceted, that by nature, we're born with kind of different aspects of our personality that could form more anxiousness or more shutdown, or if push comes to shove, then we realize that we all are born with parts. And so when we look at IFS, we're not looking or working with parts that are normal. We're looking at parts that, due to deep pain or trauma, have taken on extreme roles in our life. So these parts are classified into 3 different groups. So we have 2 different kind of protective parts, and then we have the parts that carry all of the pain. The parts that carry the pain are called exiles. And if we had a circle that kind of represented our human body or our soul, exiles would kind of be at the bottom because they're buried. And they are often those experiences that began to happen when we were really young in life. So they carry the experiences such as rejection, abandonment, deep shame, unhealthy guilt, beliefs of I am not enough, I should be more, I am alone, I can't get through this, I am not wanted. And you just begin to feel with all of those beliefs or extreme feelings, it's born out of pain.
Yeah.
And so that's why we call them exiles, because they carry all of this. And our system that wants to function so well in a protective effort tries to keep them exiled so that we are not shut down by all the pain that these exiles carry. So you have your exiles, and then you have protective parts. So two of those, you've got managers.
Yep.
And managers are the parts that have the whole theme of not on my watch. Not on my watch will pain be triggered. Not on my watch will you experience shame. So not on my watch. So they work to proactively keep these exiles from being triggered. So managers are people pleasers, approval seekers, our inner critic. There are overworkers at times. They are pessimist. They are optimist. I just worked with somebody last week. Anticipated dread was an interesting one that came out.
Wow.
Another one I worked with this last week, the wrestler. They're just going to wrestle with everything that comes their way. You know, resistance often is a manager part, but you can just see they pop up to keep you working or keep you from becoming too prideful or keep you from becoming too shut down or whatever, because they're afraid of pain being experienced.
And do you find that those managers are born at the same time as the exile? Like you had someone say something to you when you were really young that made you feel stupid. And so that the exile was born. But then at the same time, the inner critic was also born to say, I'm going to make dang sure that I never say anything that makes me feel stupid again. And if I do, I'm going to remind you of it so that way you know that that was stupid. Don't do that again. And that's a little bit of the connection there and the protection too that you're talking about.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's like they're protective, right? So when deep hurt, woundedness is experienced, these protective parts come up and do whatever they can to help you be okay. And that's the beauty of the parts. And that's why we say all parts are welcome, that we're wanting to make sure we're looking at the intention of the parts to protect you, not the behavior.
Yeah.
So for me growing up, man, I was empathic and very sensitive. I could take in anything from my environment. I really took in body language. And so for me as a child, even a look could just throw me off my rocker. But I figured out my protective part of people pleaser and approval seeker was born super young. And it really helped me because, man, I figured out I can go out of my way to make somebody feel good. I can deny myself and my own needs, but do something for you. And you are thrilled. And that fed my soul. And as a child, it's like, hey, this is a strategy that works.
Yes.
So that I'm not shut down or I'm not without a self-esteem. So we want to honor the fact that they're protective, and many of our parts that are in extreme roles really helped us survive in our younger years, if not thrive.
Yeah.
But then what I say is for me, once I become an adult and I'm a parent and I'm in ministry, if I still have that same assumption that in order to be okay, I have to have the approval of everyone, then it will bite me in the butt every time.
Every time.
Yeah.
I wonder too, because you bring up the trauma responses or the stress responses. You have fight, flight, freeze, find is another one that your husband talks about.
That's what Chuck says.
And Chuck DeGroat talks about that will find people to manage our stress. I see that a lot in leadership, that people in the upper levels of leadership don't say they have anxiety, but that's because they're passing it on to everybody else.
Yeah.
And they're finding people to manage their anxiety. They call that micromanagement in the business world. But there's another one too, which is fawn. And fawn is where you will essentially fawn over people and please them. And I've found, and maybe you've seen this too, but when I'm working with people who are helping professionals, caregivers, all of that, they will go out of their way to take care of other people to help them, but they'll do it at a deficit because they're burning off from reserves they don't have. So when you're in a trauma response and you're in high chronic stress, and I saw this once a few years ago. I had a woman whose husband died suddenly, tragically, and she was walking around at her husband's funeral asking people if they had had enough to eat.
Oh,
And it was
oh,
a classic fawn trauma response because it was easier for her to make sure everybody else was okay. And that way she didn't have to pay attention to the burden in her soul. And that, I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about. There's this trauma response of this fawning activity where she's going above and beyond to take care of somebody else, ignoring herself. She doesn't have a lot to give. And that's also the pleaser. That's the pleaser part of her that is trying to protect her from, this really deep pain that the exile is having to carry. And I feel like that all kind of works together.
oh, oh my gosh. And I mean, just that story, it sits deep in my core. And there's a part of me just wants to weep because, um, man, you can see the protective nature of probably how that part was formed and how it is keeping her today from being able to receive the love and be able to sit in her own grief,
And it's really hard. That's
so hard.
That's the nature of grief is you're never done.
Yeah.
You're never done. It's just different day by day. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think for people listening, if you have, because I think there's a good portion of the population that has the disease to please. And I think pretty much everybody I talk to has an inner critic. What are some of you mentioned the managers, what are some of the protectors? What are some of those individuals doing?
So there's two protectors. There's the managers and there's the firefighters. Are you? Yeah, the firefighters. So then, the other side of the protectors are the ones who say never again. So just like a firefighter would come to a scene whenever they're called because there's a flame in the building and they do not care what destruction is caused to the building. They're going to get that stinking flame out. Yeah. The firefighters in our life, whenever pain is experienced, they are going to take whatever measures they can to extinguish the pain.
Okay.
So these are your addictions. These are rage, sexual acting out, pornography. This is overeating, any of your eating disorders. This is going to be dissociation, forms of numbing, alcohol, substance abuse, workaholism, anything that is an ism, that's going to take over. So that once pain has started to be experienced, you can go in a whole nother direction and be distracted from it so that the pain is not too much in the moment.
So it's really either a way to numb out or it's a way to escape or it's a way to keep yourself from essentially feeling what's going on. Because, well, I mean, you guys are in Colorado, but here in Michigan, marijuana is legal. And so just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good for you. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff that I see is this, well, it's just okay. I'm just escaping a little bit. It's not all the time. It's just enough to take the edge off. And my question is, well, does the edge have to come off? Why, what is it about the edge that's so bad? Because, I mean, the reality is if you're escaping all the time, you can't selectively numb. I love Brene Brown says that you can't selectively numb. And so you're going to numb out one thing, you numb out everything else. And then all of a sudden you're not dealing with anything. Now we're in real trouble.
And usually it's a pendulum swing from, even for people who are enraged, can so quickly then come down to numb, and then you're stuck.
Yeah.
And then the shame cycle is fed. And so we've just fed that sense of the exiled experience with shame as well. And it's just this tornado as well. You know, it's interesting. I have so much empathy for the firefighter part. And almost, you know, for the men who are listening, and honestly, women, sometimes it just helps to call it these soldiered parts in us, you know, that they are soldiers that want so much for you to be protected from pain.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you listen to people who've done IFS work on firefighter parts, it's like we're not welcoming in the binge. We're not welcoming in getting drunk. We're not welcoming in pornography. What we're welcoming in is the soldier that wanted so much to protect, that went to an extreme version to protect. That's what we're honoring, is the extreme version of wanting to protect the self.
Yeah.
And that in there is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of, if you don't do this and you experience pain, there's a lot of fear of what will happen to you if you're not protected that way. The beauty of all of this is so many of our parts are stuck at younger places in our life. And so when I'm working with clients, one of the questions is, we work with parts, and even a firefighter part dissociation we were working with recently. And I'm just trying to get an age of how old this dissociative part feels to them. And by and large, it is teenage or younger.
Yeah.
That these parts feel, which means that they're just stuck at an age that typically adults are not, and don't realize that we've grown up, have a self that knows oftentimes the Lord, that has access to people, who has access to knowing that we can take a walk in nature and take some deep breaths and be able to calm in the moment, that we can really be okay amidst conflict, and we have the confidence that we can move through. They don't know.
Right.
And so when we get to the fears that these parts hold, that's where the gold is, where we can really bring compassion to their fears and honor them for trying to step in, but also be able to bring hope that there is another way. This isn't the way that we have to survive. There's another way to actually thrive.
So I was working with someone recently that was having some trouble communicating with their spouse and bringing up a desire that they had with their spouse. And I asked the question multiple times. I'm like, so what's keeping you from asking the question? And then they would go on and talk about all of these things. I was like, no, but I understand it, but you haven't actually answered the question. What's really going on there? Because it's a simple question. So really, why aren't you asking it? And after the course of like 30 minutes, and I don't know if you have this with clients, but usually we get to the answer about 5 minutes before the session needs to be done.
Absolutely. Yes.
Every time. And no matter how hard you try, and we finally came to this conclusion. My client was afraid that if they asked the question and their spouse said no, they would feel rejected.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, so the fear of rejection is driving your marriage.
Yes.
And there was this moment of profound silence, because we had finally, in your words, we got to the gold of the conversation of like, well, okay, what's really going on? here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the moments with those, because you were able to reach an exile,
Yep.
right? With rejection and fear of rejection.
Yep.
And I come back again to what Brene Brown says with the whole petri dish with shame, that if you put shame in a petri dish and you douse it with judgment and you douse it with secrecy, and silence, and you put the lid on it, that the shame is going to grow exponentially. But if you take that same shame and you put it in a petri dish and you sprinkle in empathy and you sprinkle in vulnerability and you sprinkle in presence, it's going to stunt the growth.
Yep.
And the power of, I think for all of us, because we all have exiles of rejection and fears. I'm just finding for people, the worst part of anything is bearing it alone.
Yep.
You know? So the fear of, I not only have this, but I am alone.
Yes.
When that can be held with somebody else already, that starts to bring some healing and a sense of shared humanness and a hope to be able to look beyond and that not be all that we experience. It's so powerful.
So powerful. You know, you're talking a little bit too. It reminds me of Kurt Thompson's work and how to heal from trauma, you really need a safe confessing community. And it feels like, I mean, there's the combination of therapy, but then also bringing some of these managers and these firefighters and these exiles together and just giving them permission to say, hey, we're all coexisting in this space. Yes. And none of us are wrong. None of us are wrong in our intent, but we might be wrong in our approach. And let's talk about that. I think that's some of the beautiful work of the IFS work is you get to imagine that these parts are right in front of you and give them the dignity that they deserve for the hard work that they've been doing for probably your whole life.
Yeah. And I think what happens is when we don't do the work, when we don't turn toward or start to even be able to notice, I'm wondering if something's going on here, or if I'm running into a part of me again, is that if we don't stop to be aware, this is just a part of me, then we end up in our relationship responding and showing up out of our parts rather than out of ourselves. So it sounds like in that moment that you had, oh, what a beautiful moment that you were able to show up, both of you as humans, and hold that space together. But in marriage, oftentimes, if we don't allow ourselves, we then show up. We really want to connect. We really want the rejection to be able to be held together so that we can move toward. But instead, we show up with blame, or we show up with anger, or we show up with withdrawal, or we show up diminishing our needs and somebody else's, or our inner critic just takes over for ourselves, or our judge takes over towards somebody else.
Yes.
And then it's just this dance of parts. Yeah. And we miss the beauty of the self and holding pain together.
Wow.
Yeah.
We have these exiles that are born out of trauma and pain, and we all have it. We all have it.
We all do.
We all do, because we all got hurt as a kid. I mean, I don't take this in a cavalier way, but I oftentimes tell my clients, if you want to know why you do what you do, then we at some point probably have to talk about your childhood and your parents. At some point.
Yeah.
And if you have an inner critic, there's a really good chance that it either came from mom or dad, or it came from a teacher. Because what is it? 80% of the human personality is formed by the time we're 6 years old. So it probably came somewhere. Probably from mom or dad, maybe grandpa and grandma, but probably from that. So how have you navigated that with individuals as a therapist and talking with people utilizing IFS? At some point, do you have to get to childhood for that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to say it's interesting because I have adult children and one that is 17, still in the home and about to be an adult. So it's a little crazy. Like I feel the parts rising up in me, even as we talk about family of origin, and it's probably because of mom and dad. I'm at this stage right now where I am going to my almost 24-year-old son and going, oh my gosh, can we talk about this from your growing up years?
Yes.
Can we talk about, because I'm realizing as a parent, and it can make me weep, no matter how hard I try, I'm an imperfect human that is still growing up as I raise my kids. And that when we say that we want to look back at the family of origin, or parts might have been made by parents and probably were, I want the listeners to keep in mind, all of us have some assets that we probably have from our parents, and we have some liabilities and some really hard parts that we have from our parents. And that also, as we look back at this, it's also our perception. Like trauma is always somebody's perspective of what happened. That's why two people can go through the same experience and have different beliefs about what happened. So for the parents who are like, oh, shoot, we're going to go back and do family of origin stuff again.
Say what?
I know there's an invitation that, there's just an invitation that as parents, we can continue to learn.
Yeah.
And the reality is that all of us as kids had experiences where no matter how good or how bad our parents were, we didn't always get what we needed, Yep. And because of things going on in our parents' life, they did not have the capacity to do all things and be there in all ways.
Yeah. And they did the best they can. I mean, that's what we have to work on and live with. Steve Carter, who's the author of The Thing Beneath the Thing, and he just wrote a book on grief, was on the podcast a couple of months ago. And he said, I know that I'll be successful as a parent when my kids go to therapy for different reasons than I go to therapy. And I don't know where he got that from, but I love it. And I think that it's so true. Like if my son goes to see a counselor for different reasons than I go to see a counselor, I feel like I'm on the right track.
Yes. And yes, love that. And there's just a freedom for all that. Yes, there's so many ways to go back and look at that. I know, Steve and I do, my husband, we run Capable Life, which is managing anxiety and reactivity in the home place and the workplace.
Yep.
And we're big fans of genograms. And that is where you map out your, basically your family tree, 2 generations above, and then your generation. And then if you have children, kind of that generation too. And you're looking at relationship, like where was their conflict? Where was their harmony? Where was their divorce? Where was their cutoff? Where was their mental illness? I had a guy, I led a genogram on. He came up with a new one. He's like, you know what? I was doing the genogram, and all through it, he said legalism. All through 2 generations above on down. And so he made his own symbol for legalism and mapped it all over. And it was fascinating then to look at the impact from generations that's held in him.
Wow. Yeah, that's a new one. But if you think about it, then there's some spiritual trauma in there as well, right? And so why wouldn't that track? Wow.
And as we look at parts, spiritualizer is a big part, and it is legalism. It's that sense where the gap between where we are and with our faith lens, where we feel like we should be, just it feels like impossible. So we feel like we need to be where we should be, and we don't take into account the human side of us to move or to take time to grieve or to feel what we need to feel so that we can, or to share with others so that we can make a little bit of headway or growth, but it's legalism. It's keeping us stuck at what we're not.
I talked with someone that you bring up the spiritualizer. I talked with someone a while ago who was going through some profound loss. And one of the things that stood out to me was the consistent kind of verbiage of, well, God is good. God is good, and he's going to use this for good. And it was very, very faithy. And yet it was super concerning to me at the same time. And someone actually commented like, oh my goodness, the strength of their faith. And I said, maybe, maybe that's true. It could also be the spiritualizer part that is taking over to keep the exile of pain in check. And for me, the IFS language really helps to contextualize that and ask the question, well, could it be something else? To actually get curious instead of assuming, just have a moment for curiosity. Because if you don't have that, then it's really easy to look at the spiritualizer at face value and say, well, that must be what's going on. And that's the person. But maybe that's actually a part that is overcompensating for a grieving exile. Is that getting that right there?
100%. 100%. And so as we look at parts work, we start actually with the managers or the firefighters, whatever part we're noticing showing up in us, that's where we start, because it's really hard to just get to our shame without our parts coming in to diminish or to spiritualize or whatever. And so, we start with a part and then we notice how we feel toward it, So I've got an inner critic I've actually done a lot through the years, so it's less than it once was. Thank you, IFS, thank you, God. Thank you, friends who can hold it with me. But when I first started this and I would look at my inner critic and how do I feel toward it, can we say pissed on here?
Yes. Yeah, we've said worse.
I am pissed at this inner critic, right? I am so sick of this inner critic.
Yes.
And then we realize, okay, that's another part that's showing up, that just is so tired and wants it to be done and whatever. And so then we notice I've got an inner critic and then I've got another soldiered up part that's just sick of it,
Yep.
And then we're doing work, the reactor, right? And so in IFS, there's this whole thing of unblending, because what's true is as we look at a part of us, we notice that other parts are trying to come into the driver's seat of our life.
Yes.
And disguise or cover up the access that we have to Imago Dei in us, to the spirit-led self, to the beauty, right, that God has given us in our soul self. It's not that we don't have access. We just can't see it. We're not connected to it in the moment.
Yeah.
And the more we can do, we ask, how do we feel toward it? So that we can notice, oh, there's another part that's trying to come in the driver's seat. We're going to see if we can get that soldiered part to just sit back, just relax a little bit, so we can again look at the inner critic. So the beauty is when we can bring, what the self offers, which at the end of the day, when we're in our spirit-led self, we're going to have compassion. We're going to have courage. We're going to have creativity. We're going to have a clarity. We're going to be able to have a confidence. We're going to be able to have the fruits of the spirit and access to that will bring hope and a curiosity and an invitation to these other soldiered up parts of us that desperately need it.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of the work.
And for those listening too, if you're wondering like, well, how do I do this? Well, first of all, you can find therapists who are really skilled with IFS, but even just taking some time to practice curiosity is probably instead of judging yourself for feeling the way you feel, just take a step back, take a deep breath and ask the question, well, why do I feel the way that I do? And why am I thinking those thoughts. We don't often think a lot about what we think about, and it's important for us to do that. And so that's some of the good work to do there. The other thing too that I want to mention, because Lisa, Steve is actually going to be on the podcast sometime in February, I think. So
Okay.
we're
Yeah.
going to have your
Great.
husband on, which will be exciting. And he's going to talk a little bit about his latest book, but he's also going to talk about Capable Life. But since you brought it up, I'll bring it up here and we'll put a link to the podcast, notes as well. But Capable Life is something that every single person can sign on for. You can get a membership either monthly or for the year. I'm taking a group of volunteers and leaders at the church here through Capable Life this year, and we're journeying through that together. And that's really a community that's built around things like IFS, anxiety, learning how to navigate things like burnout in ministry or burnout in leadership if you're a workplace leader. And so there's a ton of resources that are available on Capable Life, and people can just go where to sign up for that.
Yeah, you can and thank you for bringing that up. I mean, it's filled with video modules, and noticing what's going on inside you, noticing what's going on in between you and another, and man, what's going on in groups,
Yes.
And so you can go to capablelife.com. And that website will lead you right into signing up if you want to do a trial membership, if you just want to try a month. We have cohorts that can meet for 4 to 5 weeks at a time and start you with some of the foundational modules as well, so that you'd have a community around you. We have a workbook that has 6 to 8 videos, and it's reflection and group work, the beautiful guide through it that we have quite a few churches that are taking groups through as well.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of resources on there that will dip its hat to some of this work and some of the work that leads to those spaces in between you and somebody else for the sake of naming it so that we can do something about it. Rather than, as we look inside of us or in the spaces between us, we tend to want to just try harder, and do the same thing more, and it's exhausting. And so whenever we can really pause and, like with what we're talking about with IFS, take a pause, notice, what's going on in me?
Yeah.
What is it that's rising up? Where do I sense this in my body? A lot of people will, as we start this, will begin to say, oh my gosh, it's a tightness in my chest. It's always a tightness in my chest. And then it moves to my throat, where it just impacts even how I speak or my ability to speak. For some people, it's like, oh, this one is in my pit. It is a pit in my stomach, And some people are like, oh, it is just this never ending thought loop that happens again and again and again. And it keeps me from sleeping. And the spinning mind, and just even noticing, okay, this is how it shows up in me.
Yeah.
And just taking pause then to notice when that shows up in you and how often, and after what events, after what people, after what conversations, and then you can begin to name if it's a part, if it's an inner critic, if it's imposter syndrome, if it's, can't get enough. If it's this part that just shows up of do more to please. I mean, you'll just begin to notice that again and again. And it's only when we notice that we can name and actually do something with it.
Wow. That is so helpful. I also think what a great practice for people listening of like, hey, if you want to dip your toe in this, why don't you just practice asking some of the questions like, where am I feeling this in my body? Why am I feeling this way? What set me off here? What conversations did I have? Again, practicing that curiosity, I think so good. We're going to have some links to the Capable Life. We're going to have some more information on this, and who knows, maybe Lisa can come and join us another time. This has been so helpful. Lisa, I'm going to give you the last word here before we sign off, and just love to know if people are listening and they want to know more about this work, or they want to heal, in this trauma journey that they're on. What is your word for them?
Yeah. Yeah. I think my word would be take heart. That this work, the beauty of it is this work honors those filter parts that actually probably helped you still be here today.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, is these parts that we so wrestle with, really were so helpful at one time in your life. And this work also presents an invitation for these soldiered parts to stand down. And it leads into a sense of play and a sense of curiosity and a sense of trust and a sense of allowing yourself to be human sized, knowing that we have a creator God who is in control and is all things. Therefore, we can be human and lean in.
Wow.
And then I'd also just say, we always say in this work, if you are noticing something in you 2 or 3 times out of 10, that is an A, that it is not an every time. But if you can do this 2 times, it will feel different.
Yeah.
And over time, you'll be able to do something with it as well. Yeah, it's a beautiful work. There's a lot of great resources out there. I really like the work of Jenna Remersma, and her book, Altogether You, is a fantastic book on IFS and integration of IFS and faith. Also, Allison Cook's book, Boundaries for Your Soul, is so good. It's out there. Yeah. So super powerful stuff. On our Capable Life, we have a masterclass on there that's called Healing the Divided Self. And it has Allison and Chuck DeGroat on there. And we're looking at IFS. And then I lead people through a meditation on there as well that can just begin to help you notice what's going on in you, and be aware and bring some compassion to some parts. So there's steps you can do. And for people who are just so tired of a part of them, know that things change. And when we bring curiosity and when we bring the goodness of God to it, and when we bring community to it, there's a lot of healing that's possible. So take heart.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll have links to those books and all of that on the podcast notes. And that's all we have for you now. We will talk with you later.